In this video, we'll be conducting an initial set of systematic tests on the two new Apple Watches, the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and the Apple Watch Series 9. The aim is to evaluate the heart rate measurement performance, oxygen saturation measurements, and the GPS tracking accuracy of these watches. For the heart rate measurements, we'll be doing tests on both myself and on Theresa in various exercise settings such as indoor and outdoor cycling, running, and weightlifting. Our aim is to determine whether these new models have improved functionalities over their predecessors, and the standardized nature of these tests will provide you with an initial credible basis for comparison. So without further ado, let's get started. Hello everyone, for those of you that are new to the channel, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis. Now in this video, we'll be doing a first set of tests on the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and the Apple Watch Series 9. Now today's video differs slightly from our usual format. Instead of performing all tests first and then shooting the video, I'll be picking up the newly released Apple Watches today, performing all tests as I'm going, analyzing the results and sharing them with you as I'm doing them. Now, additionally, this testing process isn't limited to myself. Theresa here will also help out. I've purchased two Apple Watch Series 9s, a 41mm version for Theresa and a 45mm version for myself. Additionally, I've ordered an Apple Watch Ultra 2, which I'll mostly test on myself, but I'll also use it for some of Theresa's testing. To start, as always, we'll focus on the heart rate tracking performance, but first I need to pick up the watches from the Apple Store, so let's head out. So I thought it would be kind of cool to show you how I'm picking up the Apple Watches. Maybe it's boring, but at least you get to see some of the beautiful Vienna. So this is Karlsplatz here. Now here you can see me at the Apple Store and there were many more people there than I expected. The line was really big. And here you can see I was very happy to get all my Apple Watches. So there you quickly saw some shots of the beautiful Vienna. But now that I'm back here, let's quickly unbox the devices and set things up. I actually also bought myself a new iPhone since I want to test 4 Apple Watches at the same time. So I need 4 different iPhones. So let's first unbox this. Okay, let's start by setting up the 41mm version of the Apple Watch Series 9 for Theresa. So let's see what comes in the box, but it will be the same as always, most likely. So we have the watch itself and the watch strap that I chose, which is this blue-black Nike version. So this is the one I'm most excited about, the new Apple Watch Ultra, the Ultra 2. Let's take a look. So we have the Ultra itself and the new band I ordered. The Apple Watch Ultra 2 basically looks exactly like the other Apple Watch Ultra I own. And to finish off, let's also have a look at the 45mm version of the Apple Watch Series 9. So here we have the 41 and 45mm versions next to each other, and I really prefer the 45. For my wrist size, the 45 works really well, but I can imagine as a woman with a smaller wrist size, the 41 works better. Okay, now that we have everything set up, let's get to the actual testing. And as I mentioned, I want to start off with the heart rate tracking performance. Now, since Theresa has to leave soon, let's start by making her do some different types of exercises and analyze her data. And let's start with a short indoor cycling session where she'll be wearing the 41mm version of the Apple Watch Series 9 and the new Apple Watch Ultra 2. And after that, I will run all the analysis and get back to you with the results. Now to test that performance, I'll compare the heart rate measurements of the Apple Watches against the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, which can generally record my heart rate very accurately. And as I said, we'll start by looking at one of the easiest exercises for a watch to track, cycling indoors. Now this involves very little movement or tension on my arms and will therefore produce less noise. And here we see an overview of that accuracy for the Apple Watch Series 9 on Theresa. Now each dot here is a single heart rate measurement with along the horizontal axis the value according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap and on the vertical axis the value according to the Apple Watch. Now the closer the points are to the blue line, the better the agreement, and the darker black the color, the more dots that there are. And as you can see, overall there's a super good agreement between the Apple Watch Series 9 and the Polar H10 ECG chest strap. Almost all points are on or very close to the blue line, and also the correlation at 2 decimals is 1.00, so that's this R value up here. So that's a very good correlation. The correlation cannot be higher than 1, so a rounded correlation of 1.00 is almost perfect. But let's also look at how these heart rate measurements looked over time. And here you can see how Theresa's heart rate varied over time for both the Polar H10 ECG chest strap and the Apple Watch Series 9. Along the horizontal axis we have the time, and our heart rate is along the vertical axis, with in blue-green the heart rate according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and in red her heart rate according to the Apple Watch. And as you can see, we overall just see a very good agreement between the Apple Watch Series 9 and the Polar H10 ECG chest strap. I have honestly nothing to complain about here. And here you can see the results of the Apple Watch Ultra for cycling indoors on Theresa. And as you can see, also the Apple Watch Ultra performed very well. Almost all points are on or close to the blue line, and the correlation is also very good at 0.99. I actually noticed that there were 1 or 2 heart rate measurements that were a bit weird with the reference, and one of them is this point right here. I think here either something weird happened with Theresa's heart rate or the reference device actually made a small mistake. So maybe if we remove this point, the correlation would again be 1.00. Overall, this still looks very good, so I'm quite happy that the much heavier Apple Watch Ultra 2 also did very well on Theresa's relatively small wrists. But I do want to show you the individual ride over time so you can judge if you think that this point here is an artifact. Now, as I said, we have some weird deviating points for the Polar H10 ECG chest strap. So we see a quick drop in heart rate right here, but also right here and right here. Now, I'm not sure what's going on here. There are actually more measurements here, so this drop is a bit more gradual, but I'm only showing the matching measurements between the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, so you cannot see them all. But it is a quite sudden drop for Theresa. Now, it's not completely unexpected. Also right here, for instance, we see a quick drop. So my suspicion is that the Apple Watch Ultra sort of smoothed this part here, and in reality there was a quick drop in heart rate, and there were also a few measurements missing here for the Apple Watch Ultra, so it might have been in doubt whether the drop was real or not. But overall we basically see an almost perfect agreement for the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and the Polar H10 ECG chest strap. So it might be that the Polar H10 was wrong here or the Apple Watch Ultra, but overall the conclusion remains the same. Both the Apple Watch Series 9 and the Apple Watch Ultra are very good heart rate trackers on Theresa when it comes to cycling indoors. Okay, that looks very good for cycling indoors, honestly, which is great news. But let's make things a bit harder and let's look at how the Apple Watches handle much more movement. Theresa and I will go on a short run and see if the performance degrades. Again, I will ask her to test the 41mm version of the Apple Watch Series 9 and the Apple Watch Ultra 2. And here you can see an overview of the results of that running session that Theresa did. And again, the correlation is very good at 0.99. Almost all the points are on or close to the blue line. So this is exactly what we want to see. But again, let's also see how those heart rate patterns look over time. And here you can see how Theresa's heart rate varied over time for both the Apple Watch Series 9 and the Polar H10 ECG chest strap. As you can see, we ran several very short intervals, and overall there's a very good agreement between both devices. Only right here is there a small deviation, but otherwise the agreement is almost perfect. And the Apple Watch Ultra 2 actually also did very well for running outside on Theresa. We see that the correlation rounded to 2 decimals is again 1.00, which is super good. So I'm very happy that this much heavier watch is also performing very well on Theresa. And just to confirm, let's look at those heart rate measurements over time. And here you can see how Theresa's heart rate varied over time according to the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and the Polar H10 ECG chest strap. Again, you can see those short intervals, and here for the Apple Watch Ultra 2, the agreement is even better than for the Apple Watch Series 9. So the Series 9 showed a small issue in detecting the correct heart rate right here, and the Apple Watch Ultra 2 doesn't show this, but I think this is just by chance. Overall, both are performing very well, and I'm happy that with such a dynamic exercise, it's still doing well on Theresa. Finally, let's now test the watches for one of the most difficult exercises out there, weightlifting. Now, Theresa has to leave in an hour or so, but she agreed to do a quick weightlifting session, so let's get right to it. And here we have the results of that weightlifting session that Theresa did. And again, we see a pretty good correlation between the Polar H10 ECG chest strap and the Apple Watch Series 9. The correlation is a tiny bit lower now at 0.98, but this is still very good. Almost no watch can get a correlation of 0.98 for weightlifting. But often watches struggle to pick up on those peaks in heart rate. So let's see if that's also the case right here. And here you can see how Theresa's heart rate varied over time. And again, we see a very good agreement between the Apple Watch Series 9 and the Polar H10 ECG chest strap. There are some moments with a bit of deviation, for instance right here and also right here, where a few of the dips in her heart rate were not detected. But overall, honestly, for weightlifting, this looks pretty good. The one thing I have to mention here is that I'm only showing matching heart rate measurements. So if the Apple Watch is missing some measurements, you won't see that missing part right here. In the next video, I'll correct for that. But still, overall, you can see that many of the peaks in Theresa's heart rate were correctly detected. And now looking at the Apple Watch Ultra 2, we see that this also did very well on Theresa. The correlation is now 0.98, so the same as what we also saw for the Apple Watch Series 9. And overall, I'm very pleasantly surprised that the Apple Watch Ultra 2 does about as well as the Series 9 on Theresa, even though it's a much heavier watch. So that's kudos to Apple for designing such a good heart rate sensor and software to go with it. And here you can see how Theresa's heart rate varied over time according to the Apple Watch Ultra 2. And again, we see a good agreement between the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and the Polar H10 ECG chest strap. Most of the peaks in heart rate that Theresa had were detected correctly. You can see that, for instance, right here, but also right here, and right here. So I'm honestly not disappointed with this performance. Overall, I'm very happy with how the watches performed on Theresa. I was a bit afraid that her smaller wrist would pose a problem, but it doesn't appear to be the case. Next, I'll do similar tests on myself, including outdoor cycling. The main benefit there is that we can also compare the new Apple Watches to the older models, since I have so much test data on myself. I'll do all of the exercises now, and afterwards I'll do the analysis and report back to you. So let's get to it. And let's start again with the heart rate performance during indoor cycling, which is displayed right here for the Apple Watch Series 9. And as you can see also on me, it performed very well. All the points are on or at least close to the blue line. And the correlation is again rounded to 1.00. So that's very good. So again, this looks very good for the Apple Watch. And if we now look at the Apple Watch Ultra, we see basically the same thing. So an almost perfect agreement with the ECG chest strap. And similar to what we saw for the Series 9, the correlation is 1.00. So that's really good. Basically, no other watch performs as well as Apple Watches. And here we can actually see the spinning session over time for the Apple Watch Series 9. And as you can see, the Apple Watch Series 9 in red and the Polar H10 in blue overlap almost perfectly here. I can see no significant deviation between the two. There's a tiny bit of deviation right here in between the first two intervals, but this is really negligible. Overall, the Apple Watch Series 9 is doing really well. And if we now look at the same spinning session, but now for the Apple Watch Ultra, we basically see the same thing. There's a perfect agreement between the Apple Watch Ultra and the Polar H10, so I'm very satisfied with this result. But we can actually put this into perspective by comparing the Apple Watches to many of the other watches I've tested in the past, and that overview is displayed right here. Now the correlation value we were looking at before is the metric I will use for this, and that is displayed along the horizontal axis right here. And on the vertical axis, I ordered the watches from worst to best. So the further to the right and the higher a device is, the better is its correlation with the ECG chest strap. And here I marked the Apple Watch Ultra 2 in red, but we'll also take a look at the Apple Watch Series 9. But let's zoom in a bit because it's actually quite difficult to read. And that zoomed in view is displayed right here. So these are just the watches with a correlation of 0.9 or higher. So just the better performing watches out there. And here I marked the Apple Watch Ultra 2 in red, but the Apple Watch Series 9 is just below it right here. And as you can see, both seem to be the top performers at the moment. Now I should mention this is just based on one spinning session, so over the next few days I'll do many more tests and then we'll have a better understanding if this is a consistent result. Still, overall this is looking quite good. Now other good devices are other Apple Watches I've tested in the past. For instance, the Apple Watch Ultra, which I recently again tested, which is this Ultra Gen 1 right here. And the other Apple Watch Ultra marked right here is the test I did about a year ago. But as you can see, both gave more or less the same result. And other good watches are the Apple Watch SE 2022, the Apple Watch 8 SE, and Apple Watch Series 6. So all Apple Watches are just very good for cycling indoors. Below that, we see some Huawei watches, and also the Google Pixel Watch and Galaxy watches are not doing that poorly. Still, Apple Watches seem to be in a league of their own. However, let's now look at a more difficult exercise for a watch to track, cycling outside. Now, cycling outside increases the tension on my arms because I have to hold on to the handlebars, and there's also much more movement and bumpiness, making it much harder for the watch to get a clean heart rate signal. And if we now switch to cycling outside for the Apple Watch Series 9, we again see an almost perfect agreement with the reference device. So the correlation is again 1.00, so that's really good. So overall, I have nothing to complain about here. The Apple Watch Series 9 is just doing very well. And we see more or less the same thing for the Apple Watch Ultra. there's a tiny bit more deviation. So there are a few measurements that don't fully agree, and the correlation is slightly lower at 0.99, but this is still really good. It could be that the added weight just added a bit of shakiness, but overall it could also be random variation. So I'm still very satisfied with that performance. But as I mentioned before, it's important to look at those individual bike rides to see if there's actually any significant variation. And I did 6 bike rides in total, and these are the results for the Apple Watch Series 9 in red compared to the Polar H10 in blue. And as you can see, there's a very good overlap between both devices for this session right here. And that's basically what we see for all sessions. So right here we have the second bike ride, and again an almost perfect overlap, though maybe there's a slight delay sometimes, though it's really negligible. And that's also what we see for this second bike ride right here, where there's an almost perfect overlap between the Polar H10 and the Apple Watch Series 9. Only at some sudden dips in my heart rate does the Apple Watch Series 9 sometimes struggle to detect the absolute dip, but overall I would say this is still very good. And that's more or less what we see for all bike rides. It's very good, just the absolute dips in my heart rate and sometimes also the absolute peaks in my heart rate are not fully detected, but these are really minor details. And even though the correlation might have been just slightly worse, we see more or less the same thing for the Apple Watch Ultra 2. There's basically a perfect overlap with just differences in the small details. For instance, right here do we see a small deviation, but I would say this is negligible. And we see the same thing for all bike rides. Only sometimes some sudden peaks here in my heart rate. So these small peaks right here, and right here are not fully detected. But overall, this isn't that bad, I would say. Also, this bike ride looks really good, but similar to what we saw for the Series 9, some of the dips in my heart rate are not fully detected. But again, does anybody really care about these small details? I wouldn't, to be honest, but maybe you do. And then here for this bike ride, we see more or less the same thing, though there are a few peaks here in my heart rate, for instance, right here, and right here, where we do see some more deviation. Overall, though, I'm not disappointed. And we can again put this into perspective by comparing the Apple Watch to many of the other watches I've tested in the past, and that overview is displayed right here. And similar to before, the further to the right and the higher the device is, the better is its correlation with the ECG chest strap. And we again see that the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and the Apple Watch Series 9 are the two top contenders in this plot. But again, this is difficult to read, so let's zoom in a bit. And that zoomed in view is displayed right here. And in this case, these are just the watches with a correlation of 0.7 or higher. And as you can see, the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and the Apple Watch Series 9 are really the two best watches in this overview. And in this case, this is based on 6 bike rides for each, so that looks quite good. And we also see again that they're super close to other Apple Watches, like the Apple Watch Series 7, the previous Apple Watch Ultra, and the retesting I did, so this Gen 1 right here, but also the Apple Watch Series 8. I'm not sure if these are really significant differences or this is random variation, but it is interesting to see that these new Apple Watches are again the top 2 contenders. And we also see that similar to before, some Huawei watches are also doing decently, though not as good as the Apple Watches. And some other decent devices include, for instance, the Coral Space 3, but also the Galaxy Watch 4, the Forerunner 255 from Garmin, and even the Whoop strap is not that bad. But these are not close in performance to the Apple Watches, so the Apple Watches, as I said before, are really in a league of their own. Next, let's take a look at another exercise which is important to many of you, namely running. Now, I'm not a very consistent runner, so I just did 2 short runs, but the results are really interesting. However, first a quick side note. If you're interested in the latest updates on the wearables I'm testing, I'm planning to start back up with my newsletter and posting more off-the-cuff things on my Instagram and my YouTube Shorts channel. So if you're interested in any of those are linked below. Of course, you would also make me really happy and it would help my efforts if you subscribe to this YouTube channel. But of course, this is totally up to you. Now, enough self-promotion. Let's take a look at the performance during running. Next, if we look at running for the Apple Watch Series 9, we again see a really good agreement. I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but this performance is just really good. Again, all points are on or close to the blue line and the correlation is again 1.00, so just very good. The Apple Watch Ultra is again slightly worse with a correlation of 0.98, so not a perfect correlation, but still very good. So as I mentioned before, maybe the added weight of the Apple Watch Ultra causes a bit of shakiness on my wrist and therefore reduces the correlation. But still overall, compared to most watches out there, this is just very good and this is likely good enough for most people. And if we look at the 2 runs that I did with the Apple Watch Series 9, this looks very good. Overall, there's a pretty good agreement between both the Apple Watch Series 9 and the Polar H10. We only see some small deviations at the absolute peaks of 2 of the intervals, but still, this is not that bad. And for the second run, it looks even a bit better, though I had this small peak in my heart rate right here that was sort of smoothed by the Apple Watch Series 9. But overall, this doesn't look bad at all. It's just this dip right here and this peak right here that weren't detected. And we basically see the same thing for the Apple Watch Ultra 2, though there might be a bit more deviation. So again, this dip is missed. Also, this peak is not fully detected, or at least it has a slight delay right here. And also here at this absolute peak in my heart rate right here and also right here, is there a bit more deviation, so not a perfect heart rate detection. If we go back to the Apple Watch Series 9, this looked a bit better right here and right here. Still, both are overall doing quite well, though we do see some deviation, especially for the Ultra right here and right here. Next, let's take a look at another difficult exercise for a watch to track: weightlifting. Now, for weightlifting, it's not the movement per se that makes it hard to track your heart rate, but this exercise is actually much more difficult because of the increased tension on my wrist and on my arm, making it much harder for the watch to get a clean heart rate signal. And here we do see that the correlation has dropped a bit for the Apple Watch Series 9 to 0.95. Still, this is very good, but this is a slight drop in correlation, and we see some more points away from the blue line, indicating that the watch sometimes detected a too low right here or too high heart rate right here. And we'll see in the individual training sessions in a moment what's going on, but let's first look at the Apple Watch Ultra. And that is displayed right here. And surprisingly, here the Ultra did just as well, or even a bit better actually, than the Apple Watch Series 9. So the correlation is now 0.97 versus the 0.95 of the Apple Watch 9. Though again, this might be random variation. I'm not sure this is actually a difference in performance. But still, we need to look at the individual training sessions to see if they can actually pick up on those peaks in my heart rate, which is where most watches struggle. And if we look at weightlifting with the Apple Watch Series 9 right here, we see generally a pretty okay agreement with the ECG chest strap. In the beginning right here, it did struggle a bit. So sometimes it failed to pick up on the absolute peak in my heart rate, for instance right here, but also right here and right here. And at other times it detected a bit of a too high heart rate, for instance right here and right here. And this is especially here in the beginning when I was doing bench presses. Later on, when I was doing dips, for instance, right here, it was doing quite well. And if we now look at the Apple Watch Ultra 2, we see more or less the same thing, though it might have done a bit better. I think here in the beginning, it does do a bit better than what we saw for the Apple Watch Series 9 before. But again, later on, both are doing quite well. Though here we see that the Ultra 2 detected a few extra peaks in my heart rate, or at least a higher peak in my heart rate right here, and right here. Still, overall for weightlifting, both are pretty decent. Weightlifting is very hard for most smartwatches, and the Apple Watches are doing better than basically any device out there. Still, if you care about weightlifting, my general recommendation is an ECG chest strap. And let's again put this into perspective by comparing the Apple Watches against many of the other watches I've tested in the past, and that overview is displayed right here. And similar to before, the further to the right and the higher devices, the better is its performance. And again, we see that the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and also the Apple Watch 9 are amongst the top watches out there. But let's zoom in a bit so we can read those labels. And here I've zoomed in, just leaving the watches with a correlation of 0.7 or higher. And as you can see, the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and the Apple Watch Series 9 are both performing quite well. Interestingly, the correlation of the Apple Watch Series 9 is slightly worse than some of the other Apple Watches I've tested. Though again, I have to say this is just based on one weightlifting session. So over the next days, I'll do much more testing and then we'll see if that value shifts a bit higher. Still, the only watches I can really recommend for weightlifting are Apple Watches, so that includes the Ultra 2 and the Apple Watch Series 9 we're testing right here, and some selected Huawei watches. I expect that any watch with a correlation of 0.9 or higher is likely not good enough for weightlifting. And again, as I mentioned, if you really want the best results for weightlifting, just get an ECG chest strap. Still, I'm satisfied with the performance of the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and the Apple Watch Series 9. Both are doing quite well. The conclusion here seems pretty straightforward to me, though more testing is definitely needed. Namely that both the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and the Apple Watch Series 9 seem pretty great heart rate trackers. Apple Watches are generally very good at this, and these watches are no exception. Next, let's take a look at the GPS tracking performance of these Apple Watches. I tested this by cycling the same route 3 times and checking if the signals overlap really well, which would be good, or if there's actually a large deviation, which would be bad. And let's start with 3 times I cycled to work with the Apple Watch Series 9, and those results are displayed right here. Now the green markers indicate the moment that the watch acquired the signal, and I always start my workouts on the corner right here. And since I don't give the watch any extra time to acquire the signal, this means it was basically acquired instantly, which is really good. But the next thing that's really important is checking how consistent these routes are. So let's take a look. So if we zoom out a bit, we see there's some deviation here in the beginning, but later on here it seems to be a bit better. It's interesting that right here all 3 signals seem to bend a bit away from the road, so I don't know what's going on right there. Still, they're quite consistent, and if we go along the route, that looks quite good. The signals are generally quite consistent, though here there's quite a bit of deviation. We see there's quite some difference between the signals, and here all of them are going through some buildings, so this doesn't look that good. Then if we go along the route, here again it looks quite good, I would say. Also here it's not that bad, but here the signals seem to be a bit smoothed out, so I generally take the corner quite tightly, and that's not what we see right here. But the consistency between the signals here looks quite okay, I would say. Also here it's not bad, and if we zoom out a bit, we see it's generally pretty consistent. There are some deviations, so it's not perfect, but it's also not bad. It's better than most watches, though maybe just slightly worse than we see for Garmin, for instance. Though here we see, for instance, that the consistency between the signals is really good. Also right here and right here. This corner looks a bit better than before. It's still a bit smooth, but not bad at all. And then if we look along this part of the route, it looks quite good again. So I'm not disappointed. Interestingly, here there's again a bit more deviation between the signals. But still, overall, I'm not disappointed with this performance. This looks quite decent. It's not amazing, but good enough, I would say. And we see more or less the same thing for cycling back from work, though it might even be a bit better. The signals are acquired almost instantly, as you can see right here. Then if we look at the consistency between the signals, this looks quite good. So if we go along the route, we see some deviation right here, but here the signals are really consistent, so that's not bad at all. Also right here it looks quite good. Here the signals deviate a bit from the map, but overall this isn't that big an issue. The street is quite wide right here, so I think maybe this marking isn't fully correct. Then here there is a bit of deviation and it's going through some buildings, so that's not amazing, but the signals are quite consistent here. So that's honestly looking quite good, I would say. I need to do more testing and we see some more deviation right here. But still overall the consistency between the signals is quite good. Now I'm not sure if Apple artificially pushes the signal a bit more towards the roads and that makes them more consistent, or if this is more or less the raw GPS signal. There are some better watches out there, but Apple is definitely amongst the better watches. Now I cannot really quantify this yet, but overall I'm not disappointed by this. But next, let's take a look at the Apple Watch Ultra. And here we have the results for the Apple Watch Ultra. So these are 3 times I cycled to work. And again, we see that the signals are acquired almost instantly, which is good. Though in the beginning here, we do see a bit of deviation. This is also what we saw for the Series 9. So it appears that the watch might need some time to get a more accurate signal. So there's some deviation right here. Interestingly, and I didn't look at this before, we do see quite some deviation right here for the Apple Watch Ultra. Though slowly here the signals get to be more consistent. And then if we go along the route, it's okay, I would say. There is a bit more deviation right here. Then here I would say it looks quite good. Also here it's not bad, though again it does appear that there's some artificial smoothing here around the corner where it's really a more tight corner that I take. Then going a bit along the route, it doesn't look that bad. Honestly, here the consistency is really good. Also right here and right here, there's fewer buildings here, so it's a bit easier for the watch. But as we go along the route here, the signals are really consistent, so it looks really good. Also here the corner is a bit smooth, but still looking okay. And then further along this route, I would say it's decent. There's a bit of deviation right here. Here, honestly, there is quite some deviation, so this isn't looking that amazing. Still, overall, on average, it looks quite okay. Also here, there's quite some deviation. And also here near the end, it's not perfect. So overall, there are some parts that are really consistent, some parts that are less consistent and show more deviation. I still need to look at the way back, but based on this so far, I would say this looks more or less similar to what we saw for the Series 9, or at least the conclusions would be the same, that the GPS tracking of the Apple Watch Ultra is pretty good. It's not as good as some other watches out there, but it's pretty good. It's among the better watches. But as the final test, let's look at the results for 3 times I cycled back from work, and that is displayed right here. Again, the signals were acquired almost instantly, which is good, though there is a bit more deviation here in the beginning. Then as I cycle along, there is quite some deviation right here, I must say, and it stays for quite a while. Then we do see right here that the signals get a bit more consistent, and also right here it looks quite good. Here we see a bit of deviation, also right here some deviation. Then here it looks quite good again. Here also some deviation, so not amazing. Then here the consistency is okay, even more than acceptable I would say, though there is some deviation. And also right here the signals are pretty consistent. So overall my conclusion remains the same. The GPS tracking performance is pretty good. It's not amazing, but good enough for most people. Interestingly, just based on this limited test, the Series 9 appears to be slightly better at GPS tracking than the Ultra, though this is a very preliminary result, so I wouldn't draw any definitive conclusions, but this is just a rough observation that I made now based on this testing. But let's see, once I do more testing, if these conclusions remain the same or if we see that both are performing similarly. To close off, let's take a look at the oxygen saturation measurements of the Apple Watch Series 9 and the Apple Watch Ultra 2. And in terms of SpO2 testing, I was a bit limited in what I could actually do today. But what I could check is if either of these watches ever falsely detected too low SpO2 value, and that is displayed right here. So I took many measurements throughout the day with both the Series 9 here in this red bar and the Ultra 2 in this blue bar. And I wanted to see if they ever falsely detected a low SpO2 value. Now each dot here is a single measurement taken by either the Series 9 or Ultra 2, and normal values are generally between 95 and 100%. And as you can see, the Series 9 always detected values within the normal range, but interestingly the Ultra 2 tended to detect lower values. So we can see most are still in the normal range, but are generally lower than those of the Series 9, and even twice it detected an oxygen saturation of 93%, which is quite low for me honestly. I wouldn't have that on a normal day. So these are probably false low measurements. Still, overall, this doesn't look too bad. And for the actual testing over the next weeks, I'll take them with me in a low oxygen environment to see if they can correctly detect a lowered oxygen saturation. But for now, I would say that these results are okay, though I find it a bit strange that the Apple Watch Ultra tends to detect lower values. I'm not sure if it has to do with the wrist I'm measuring it on. So the Apple Watch Ultra 2 is on my right arm and the Series 9 on my left arm. So I'm not sure if there's a difference right there, or an actual difference in the sensor layout of the two watches. Still, it's reassuring to see that most measurements are within a normal range. So what is my conclusion? Well, both the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and the Series 9 are amazing heart rate trackers, decent GPS trackers, and the oxygen saturation measurements seem okay, though more testing is definitely needed. And that is a general limitation of this video. These are the first results I have, but more testing is definitely needed. Still, I think that the conclusions I just listed are relatively reliable, but I'll be doing more testing over the next days and weeks, so stay tuned for those videos. The next question is, are these watches actually any better than the generation or generations before? And my impression is, at least in terms of health and sports tracking, probably not, or at least not much. So if you already own an Apple Watch from say Series 6 or later, I personally wouldn't upgrade, though you might be missing some features. However, if you do not own an Apple Watch yet, I can definitely recommend Apple Watches in general, and that includes these 2 new releases. Now, if you do decide to get an Apple Watch, a Whoop strap, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper, and at the same time you want to support the channel, there are different affiliate and non-affiliate links in the description below that do not cost you any extra, and some even provide a discount. Now, given that you watched this whole video on the Apple Watch 9 and Ultra 2, you might also be interested in this video right here on the sleep tracking of Apple Watches. And in the meantime, I want to thank you for watching and catch you in the next video.